When we are called upon to identify revolutions and world-changing efforts, why do we always look so far away? We cross oceans, lands, and seas being critical of foreign people fighting cultural injustice and inequality. Do we believe we have no problems of our own? Or is it simply easier to look down upon other countries, such as France, Syria, Tunisia, China, Hong Kong, and Iran, rather than to admit that there are people in our own country, Canada, who are facing absurd inequality and are being stripped of their rights? Is it easier for us to just look away? In the late 15th century, British and French colonies were established on the land that would become Canada. At this time, there were approximately 500,000 native people according to Canada's Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples. For thousands of years before the arrival of the Europeans, the Aboriginal people of what is now Canada organized themselves as sovereign nations with governmental jurisdiction over their lands based on the belief that the Creator wished for them to care for the land and share it with the plants and animals who also lived there. Things started to go wrong when the Europeans asked if they could establish fur trading posts or settlements. The Aboriginal peoples often gave them permission to do so. It is unlikely, however, that the Aboriginal peoples were aware that it was this decision which would cause their descendants to forfeit their sovereignty and land rights. The natives appeared to have been willing to share with the Europeans in exchange for the benefits of European technology and trade goods. For the most part, Aboriginal peoples and Europeans' contact was initially commercial. For example, the Hudson's Bay Company, created by Royal Charter in 1670, established the majority of the fur trading posts. The fur trade introduced European tools and weapons as well as other technology and consumables including alcoholic spirits, which affected the Aboriginals' way of life. As another consequence of this prolonged contact, Canada's Aboriginal people suffered great losses from outbreaks of newly introduced infectious diseases for which they had no natural immunity, such as influenza, measles, and smallpox, resulting in a 40 to 80% population decrease in the centuries after European arrival. The Aboriginal people began to realize that their new European neighbors intended to stay in North America, and for fear that the Europeans would influence their culture and land claims, they sought to formalize their relationship with the newcomers by treaties of peace and friendship. Before the arrival of the Europeans, Aboriginal peoples had their own protocols for negotiating treaties among themselves. The Europeans were also accustomed to entering into treaties with other nations. Nation-to-nation treaty relationships were therefore familiar to both sides. By the treaty that they formed, each party acknowledged the sovereign independence of the other and agreed not to interfere with it. By these treaties, the Aboriginal parties retained their complete independence as a sovereign nation and ownership to their lands and resources. They did not transfer or cede jurisdiction or land rights to the British Crown. However, things did not stay peaceful for long. After a three-way war between the French, English, and the natives, in which the natives and British as allies were victorious, the British Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This document protected the land rights of the Aboriginal people by prohibiting private persons from settling on or purchasing the lands. The proclamation also created a formal process for the transfer of Aboriginal lands to the Crown. The defeat of the French and the formation of the Royal Proclamation caused a major shift in British Indian policy. Because the Crown no longer needed the Aboriginal nations as allies against the French, it began to assert authority over them and their lands. Instead of regarding them as an independent sovereign people to be dealt with on a nation-to-nation basis, the Crown began to treat them as subjects who were under the Crown's jurisdiction. Between the Royal Proclamation and the current day, there have been many acts, proclamations, agreements, and treaties around the native people, their sovereignty, and the claims they have to their herited land, each of which, it seems, lessens the amount of autonomy the natives truly have. The worst of these, the Indian Act of 1876, which was signed shortly after the Confederation of Canada, allowed the government to remove native children from their homes and take them to facilities known as residential schools, where they were forced into Catholic English normalities, and if they did not comply, they were beaten or starved. There is also evidence that many of the children admitted to these schools were raped. The last federally operated residential school was closed in 1996. In total, about 150,000 First Nations children passed through the residential school system, and at least 4,000 of them died while attending the schools. Approximately 30% of Native children were placed in residential schools nationally. Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada, made the following apology in 2008, hoping to provide some relief to the victims of these establishments and their families.
I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
As heart-touching and well-spoken this apology may have been, it would be easier accepted if conditions for Native Canadians had improved. Today, Aboriginal Canadians are forced to face horrifying conditions as their reserves are pushed further and further north, towards inhabitable Canadian permafrost, while the Europeans, who they once saw as an allied nation, take over and destroy the land which they have inhabited for thousands of years. One of countless examples of these horrors is at the reserve at Attawapiskat in northern Ontario, where Aboriginals are living under third world conditions.
After treaty signing in 1926, services were incomplete from the beginning, and our culturally rich life turned into poverty and poor health conditions, which put us now at the bottom of a mainstream society. Poor living conditions, lack of access to good drinking water and health care, inadequate mental health services, the loss of identity, particularly amongst the youth who are educated in an alien education system, are some factors that eventually led to tragedies.
Attawapiskat is one of many reserves which has received this third world fate. Often when their land is threatened, Native people fear that tragedies like what happened at Attawapiskat will happen to them and the people that they love. Because of this, Native people have learned to fight back. The Oka standoff in 1990 is an example of these people attempting to stand up for the land that is rightfully theirs. After expansion of a Quebec golf course threatened to reduce the size of a sacred Native burial ground, there were violent reactions from the people. The Mohawk natives were armed and began blocking off the roads and bridges to limit how far the construction machines could make it onto the sacred land. The Oka crisis lasted 78 days, and gunfire early in the crisis unfortunately killed Corporal Marcel Lemay, and the golf course expansion which had originally triggered the crisis was eventually cancelled by the mayor of Oka. Unfortunately, Attawapiskat and Oka are not the only examples of Native crisis. Over the past 3 decades, over 700 Aboriginal women have been murdered and gone missing, and still the Canadian government has done nothing.
We haven't forgotten these women. They may be missing, but we haven't forgot about them. They're students, they were mothers, they were grandmothers, just happened to be at the wrong place. And because they were an Aboriginal woman, they became a target. It's really for their families who have no closure. I can't imagine how they go through every day wondering where their daughter, their mother, their auntie, their grandmother is. Where are they?
These are women that have just vanished off the face of the earth. And this is something that Montrealers, Canadians need to know about.
Idle No More, a grassroots social movement, is a collaborative effort of many Native protection groups and has quickly become one of the largest Indigenous movements in Canada. The movement has called together millions of Natives and non-Natives alike in an allied force in teach-ins, rallies, and protests across Ontario and beyond. Idle No More has put their foot down to end the unstable relationship between Native Canadians and the government. Consisting now of more than 2 million members, this is no longer the humble group which began in rural Saskatchewan protesting looming parliamentary bills designed to desolate Native rights. Idle No More has become a movement which has changed the social, environmental, and political landscape of Canada, and as supported by the theories of revolutionary philosophers, is becoming one of Canada's first home turf revolutions. As defined by Goldstone in his book Revolutions, A Very Short Introduction, he states that a revolution is a movement which has gained support and is represented in a series of revolts or protests. These revolts later lead to what Thomas Kuhn, in his influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, defines as a paradigm shift, or more simply put, a political reform. Idle No More already has goals to have a mandatory Native elder involved in all parliamentary decisions in order for the best interests of our Native Canadians to be considered. Along with this, the Native movement has gained over 2 million supporters and is frequently seen in nonviolent drumming revolts at Parliament Hill and other influential areas of Canada. Colin J. Beck theorized that social movements are more likely to become a revolution when there is a shift in world culture that brings the issue to light. It is understandable even though many Canadians have trouble discussing topics such as Native rights. As ecology is coming more to the forefront of world culture, Idle No More and their wishes to protect and restore heritage land will be more common in conversation. Jack A. Goldstone states in another of his works that there are major elements that cause and create a powerful revolution, which are the following: economic strain, a strong opposition between large powers, a general idea of injustice, a shared need for resistance, and a shift in international relations. The Idle No More movement contains 4 of the 5 of these factors: the economic strain visible in the native reserves, the obvious injustice between the natives and the non-natives, especially concerning women, the shared need for resistance in their large growing movement, and the strong international relationship forming between Canadian and American First Nations people. According to these theories, the Idle No More movement contains many of the needed factors to turn it into a powerful revolution capable of a paradigm shift that will end the inequality once and for all. Though Idle No More is a movement of great importance, in the minds of many it is not yet a revolution, and clearly it is becoming one. The protection of Canadian people and our beautiful land is something which affects us all. Over the years, Canadian land has been subject to corporate destruction, reducing our great mountains to stone quarries, our beaches and prairies to oil mines, and our rivers and lakes to polluted toxic pools no longer compatible with life. Idle No More, like a silent fire, is a slow-burning revolution under our very feet, which has burned for far too long. As Canadians, we must stand together. Idle No More.